Thanks, Tracy, for that warm introduction, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to have a chat about planning approvals and EPA licensing. For those of you in the audience, I'm sure you're quite familiar with some of the challenges with planning approvals and licensing. And when you actually talk to proponents, whether they're owners and operators of current facilities or looking to invest to develop their own facilities, it's the part of the whole process that causes the most frustration, sometimes expense and delays. So I thought I'd share some reflections from our practice in terms of how we can try and accelerate and minimise the cost and expense with this process. So what I'll do, I'll firstly touch on the pipeline of new infrastructure projects coming through the system in New South Wales. For those interstate attendees here today, sorry, this is going to be a little bit New South Wales centric, but I'll try and broaden it as we get into the planning and assessment approach. We'll have a look at ways of navigating the planning approval system and some of the strategies that proponents can look at and implement within their projects to try and expedite the overall planning and approvals process for a particular type of project. So, the new pipeline and recycling infrastructure projects. Robbie, in the presentation before, certainly highlighted some of the opportunities in terms of infrastructure investment, but also some of the new projects coming through the pipeline. So, the New South Wales Government is investing just over $800 million in new infrastructure across the state between 2013 and 2021. So that's quite a massive sort of turbocharged for industry to bring forward these development projects across the state. And when you actually add up the numbers, there's over 170 projects that just the government is helping to co-fund. So that doesn't include all the other private sector and also local government projects which are being brought forward into the approval system outside of that funding framework. And not surprisingly, there's massive pressure on the New South Wales planning and approval system as a result. So by putting together projects which are well designed and can sort of expedite the planning and approvals process, it's a pretty smart move given the pressure on the planning system at the moment. So just to give you an idea of the pressure on councils and state government in terms of approvals, you can actually look at some of these numbers, and councils are actually monitored by the Department of Planning in terms of their approval timeframe for local developments. So in 2014-15, there were just over 16,000 DAs for non-residential or commercial developments. That includes a whole range of commercial projects, of which resource recovery projects are a small percentage. But 16,000, that's massive across the state. And currently, councils on average are taking about 54 days for the assessment of those projects, which isn't too bad. And the rate of increase in DAs is about 6% per year, so that's quite substantial. But what we're finding with a lot of resource recovery development projects, they're not so much at the small scale, they're very much at the bigger scale, and they fall under either the designated or state significant development category, for which the Joint Regional Planning Panels or the Department of Planning is the approval authority. So looking at the DPE's or Department of Planning Environment's report card, so they received they're currently assessing 18 state significant development projects, of which there's one less as a result of Suez's approval, which is great. But 17 that were submitted in 2016 are still under assessment. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the time frame. And when you actually look at the numbers around the last 10 major projects approved, the average time frame between when the development application was submitted right through to determination was 428 days. So that's a long time when you're a proponent to wait for your eventual planning and approval to actually do something on the ground. So that's just a little chart with the 10 most recent approved projects. They do vary quite substantially, and there can be a whole range of factors which can delay an approval. So a request for further information or further studies and investigations that either council or the department may actually require can actually really delay projects there. So I'll let you, at some other point, go through those projects. I don't want to identify the one with a really long bar there, but you can see the range of approval timeframes for these projects. So one of the questions we're asked by proponents, how do I get my planning approval? And how long is it going to take? And it's a really tough question to answer in terms of the length of time it's going to take. But it's actually surprising that a lot of proponents don't actually understand the planning system and the relevant approval pathway for their particular project. So this slide's a little bit busy, but it sort of captures basically the planning and licensing laws in New South Wales. Basically, projects on the left-hand side are the smaller projects. So a composting project, less than 5,000 tonnes, is generally a local development that's approved by council and will only require a licence if they take in more than 200 tonnes of food a year. But most typically, projects tend to fall on the right-hand side of the slide. So what we're finding is a lot of projects are designated. So if you look at that column in the middle, for example, dry MRFs and also sorting and recovery facilities for C&I and C&D waste materials, over 30,000 tonnes, what they typically are classified as designated developments. So these are developments under planning law, which are determined by the Joint Regional Planning Panel, so they're actually taken away from councils to some extent, and those projects, of course, need EPA licensing. And the column on the far right-hand side is state significant development projects. These generally take the longest to get approved. These are generally the much larger projects, and we're seeing a lot more of these come through the planning and approval system, because if you're going to spend all this time and effort to get your project approved, you may as well go for an approval which gives you room for growth into the future for your particular type of facility. This slide's actually very similar to David's and Phil's in terms of the planning assessment process for projects. And that's a bit of a snapshot of the Environmental Planning Assessment Act and also the POE Act. But generally with bigger projects, there is a preliminary environmental assessment which is really critical. We see some really bad ones done, a few page overview of a particular project, and proponents are a little bit shocked to find that council or the Department of Planning throw the book at them in terms of their planning and environmental investigations they need to actually perform. And it's because the approval authority has no idea what the proponent actually proposes to do. So generally a preliminary environmental assessment is needed. Then if it's a bigger designated or a state significant development project, a Secretary's environmental assessment requirements is required by or from the Department of Planning, which sets out the requirements for the EIS. Then the EIS is prepared, agency consultation's done, industry and also the community is able to provide submissions and the proponent needs to respond to those. Then the general terms of approval are issued and then the consent, hopefully, is issued at the end of the process. Okay, some strategies for minimising approval risk and delays. Probably one of the first ones and the simplest ones to do is due diligence. So we see a lot of projects that come to us where the proponent has selected a site. In some cases they have not a lot of background information on whether the site is approved for a particular type of use at the moment. Or they may not even know the relevant planning zone that the site actually falls under and whether the type of project is actually permissible under planning law at that particular site. Understanding easements which may affect the property is really important, and also what state environmental planning policies may influence the type of development possible on that site. One of the biggest ones is proximity to residential dwellings and residential zones. So that often kicks projects from a local development into a designated development, and that will require more environmental investigations in terms of the approval process. And also other environmental issues. So by just checking these constraints on a particular site, a developer can really easily just rule out a site. It's going to be an absolute nightmare for an approvals process. Don't even touch it. So doing those checks and balances early in the piece is smart planning. Yep, thanks Tracy. The next stage is really engaging in early consultation with council, so engaging in a pre-lodgement meeting. And this is really, really important to understand what the local planning and approval requirements are, and to also start to engage with with council and also other regulatory agencies in terms of the approval requirements for a particular project. We always recommend the EPA and Department of Planning be consulted in terms of the particular design operation of a particular type of development, and some of the key issues that they may be familiar with in terms of the history of the site that you as a proponent may not be familiar with. So getting a good understanding of that is really important, and also helps develop a relationship with the regulator too. A lot of developers that we work with are, how would you say it, petrified of consultation. They are really scared of it, and it's certainly not scary. The community appreciates being consulted and being consulted early. The community really doesn't like to be consulted once the decision is made or when the project's fully scoped and ready for approval. That tends to set the community offside. So understanding those community views are really important in terms of the process. Avoiding superficial consultation. I think planning and development in this state is at a point whereby you can't get away with superficial sort of notional consultation with the community. Placing an ad in a local paper is not really good enough to indicate the community's on side with your project. And probably lastly, the main strategy is really addressing all the approving body requirements. So council and the Department of Planning will issue you with that guidance in terms of preparing your development application. And we sometimes get called in to help proponents finalise their approval, and it's pretty common that DAs are missing studies, they're missing critical bits of information which the council or the department needs to assess and approve that particular project. So checking all the boxes is really important. There's some changes to planning law coming through. Basically, the Department of Planning is requiring proponents to engage in much more rigorous community consultation with the environmental assessment process, and holding developers to account with regard to their conditions to the consent. So once you get your project approved, they'll hold you to account in terms of compliance with your consent conditions, which is a good thing at the end of the day. So that's a little bit of a snapshot, and there's my details if you need any further info. Thank you.